Good morning, everyone. I'm Amber Schorg. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, our Illinois-Iowa Ecological Services Field Office specifically. My counterpart, Michael Budd, is the state coordinator for the private lands program here in Illinois. So we'll be chatting with you today about Boltonia decurrens, which is a listed species under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So next slide, please. So my part is just a bit of a background about the species to set the stage for the real showstopper, which is Mike's work up and down the Illinois River. So a few quick facts about Boltonia decurrens. It's a member of the aster family, as you can see right here. It's pretty tall when it is in full bloom in its second year. It's about 4 to 6 feet tall, and it can create thick stands, or it can be kind of sparsely populated in different areas. It's got a couple of unique features that make it really stand out and fairly identifiable, and that is it's kind of a lighter green leaf color, which is unique, and in particular the leaves are decurrent, so the leaf margin extends along the stem and makes the stem look, appear to be winged. So that's one of the major characteristics that also distinguishes it between distinguishes it from the very similar Boltonia asteroides, which is found along the Illinois River as well. Next slide, please. So its current range and also historical range, as far as we know, started up in LaSalle, Peru, kind of in the upper reaches of the main body of the Illinois River, and it extended down through the St. Louis area. Historically, we had a couple of populations along the Mississippi, southern and into the kind of the boot heel of Missouri there, but I don't know the status of those populations. I think those are primarily historic. Its habitat, it's very much a preferent cycle. It's a biennial plant typically, so in the first year it'll be a rosette, and then the second year it does bolt up and Boltonia and flowers and sets seed, usually in between August and October, with the majority of it blooming happening in September. The seeds, there's kind of two kinds of seeds that Boltonia produces, some that float and some that sink. But the most important piece here is that they germinate the best in high light conditions and disturbed bare soil conditions. That's pretty essential for the regrowth of these populations. And the Boltonia itself, along its range, it acts more like a metapopulation. It's not kind of like our orchids that tend to stick in one spot. We think that it disperses, it booms and busts in different areas according to whether or not it has the right conditions to flourish. And that's just a crucial part of its life cycle that makes managing the species fairly tricky, but also pretty interesting to study. So the seeds, however, do have a really long period of viability. So one study by Baskin and Baskin found that they had very high, like 90% germination rate after 88 months. So it persists for a long time in the soil bank, waiting for those conditions to arrive. So next slide, please. It is a federally threatened plant species, and it has a few kind of major stressors that are preventing it, or that have prevented it from flourishing and being, restoring it to its historical abundance on the Illinois River. I think first and foremost, and probably the most important stressor of the plant populations, are the irregular flood cycles, and specifically the prolonged and late season flooding that we have on the Illinois River in more recent times. At the bottom of this slide here is just a graph that I found to be pretty fascinating. If you look where the word year is, it's under 1998. There are about 96 years to the left of that word there, and there's only about 30 years to the right of that, but they have the same number of very high flood crest events, which shows us, obviously, as we all know as river practitioners, that our river is behaving a lot differently than it has historically. And I think one important point to make here is that the flood cycle is very important for the persistence of Boltonia, but specifically the type of flooding that creates scouring events and bears soil, as opposed to prolonged ponding flood events that I think is a lot more prevalent these days. So that's one of the things that's challenging about managing the species that Mike is going to address here pretty soon. And of course, herbicide use, habitat conversion, kind of the very similar things that stress out other threatened and endangered plant species in the Midwest. And then the very last one that I'll talk about, which is kind of in the middle of the slide here, is competition from both herbaceous and woody plants. Boltonia, as I mentioned earlier, really thrives in bare soil, and it needs that disturbance in order to germinate. So it can be quickly overpowered and outcompeted by woody plants in particular that shade it out and compete for space and sunlight. So next slide, please. And the last little bit of background here is the species has a recovery plan. It was written quite a while ago, but the three main recovery criteria for the species for us to consider it for delisting would be research to determine what the requirements are of a naturally reproducing population, which has been done thanks to the efforts of some very dedicated researchers, Dr. Marion Smith, the late Dr. Marion Smith specifically, and Paige Mettler-Cherry. So they've done some really great work. If you're interested in reading about the species, anything published by them will give you a really good picture of what it does and what it looks like. And then also 12 geographically distinct, self-sustaining, protected populations. So when I first started working with the species, I was picturing the population as, a site that has Boltonia. But I think there's room here to really explore the metapopulation dynamics of this and really define what a population is. And maybe it looks like several sites that has, at least one occurrence among them. I think there's a real opportunity to think differently about the species and what self-sustaining might look like for it. And then the third criteria is that these populations will be stable or increasing for at least 5 years. And it has been really challenging to collect 5 consecutive years of data on even just a few populations because of the nature of the river and where it is found. So site access is a barrier to that. So again, this is also an opportunity to think differently about how to survey the species and what kinds of new, maybe remote technologies can be used to give us a better understanding of where the potential and the occupied habitat is. So that's a little bit of Boltonia 101, and I will turn it over to Mike to talk about his recovery actions on the Illinois River.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amber. So our program looked at this species, and we thought it would be a good opportunity for us as a private lands program to kind of target this species and incorporate it into a lot of our wetland projects up and down the Illinois River Valley, because our private lands program does have some requirements, or it is in our policy to work towards delisting some threatened and endangered species. It's not the only thing we do, but it is one thing that we should be working on as federal biologists. So with that, we looked at where the historical occurrences of this species was up and down the river valley using past data to see what it looked like today. And we also knew that we would have to find out how we could mimic scouring flood events, because this plant, as Amber mentioned, it needs that disturbance on the ground. So how do we get disturbance back on the ground that would hopefully set the stage for Boltonia to take off in these areas? And then, since we do work with private landowners in our program, the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, who would want that on their property? It's a federally threatened plant. And so most landowners are going to run away when you mention that. But thankfully, we're finding the opposite with that. So it's been working good so far. And I'll get to that aspect of it in a minute. And then, the other part of a recovery program is to monitor and adapt, because I doubt we got it right the first year or second year, but we'll keep monitoring what we've been doing to see what works and what doesn't work, and change our game plans going forward. So as I mentioned, we looked at the historical records. Where did it exist historically? Where were those polygons of the sites? And then we looked, is it still a wetland? Is it still an emergent wetland? Or is it full of woody vegetation or invasive species? And what is the ownership status? Is it private lands? Is it somewhere that we can work through our program? And what we find in a lot of cases is that succession has taken over. You have willows and cottonwoods or perennial herbaceous plants that will take over in these areas fairly quick if you don't stay on top of it, if you don't have that big flood event that sets back succession. Or in our realm of things, working with, say, duck clubs or private landowners, when there's a change in ownership or a change in management, you usually have a year or two where nothing gets done between sales. And within a few years, if willows take off in an area, it can be on the capability of a landowner or land manager to get those woody plants back under control. But that is what we're seeing in a lot of cases, is woody vegetation has taken over, and it presents an opportunity for us to go in and work with the private landowners to grind that down and get it back down in the bare dirt. And hopefully Boltonia decurrens will pop back up as a result. And so the methods, how do we get it back down to bare dirt? How do we mimic a scouring flood event and set back succession within the floodplain? And my time in Arkansas working with moist soil management and other woody invasive plants, such as the decurrens that you see, it's a salt bush, but we can knock that out pretty quick with a heavy offset disc and either a beefed up tractor or a bulldozer and a heavy offset disc. And that to me is, that's a scouring flood event. We're just using it with a tractor or dozer these days. And a lot of times it's too big. The willows are too big for that type of machinery at first. So we're going in with grinders, mulching everything down, mulching these willow stands down. And then we're taking a heavy offset disc over that, because the heavy offset disc is going to really dig in and incorporate all that material into the soil. But another good thing about it is it's going to dig down a few inches, in some cases 6 inches or more, depending on how soft it is, and it's going to pull that seed to the surface. So ideally, there is Boltonia decurrens seed still in the seed bank, and now we're moving it to the surface where it can be exposed to sunlight and it's free from competition. And ideally, it's going to jump up and bolt out of the ground, as Amber put it. So the early adopters so far, we've been surprised and happy as duck clubs. The duck clubs have jumped on this because they want to get rid of their willows and they want to help manage some of these areas that have blown up over time. And they also know, or our sales pitch to them is that, look, you might get this threatened plant species, but you're going to get duck food next to it as well. It's not going to be a monoculture. It's going to be a buffet for waterfowl when we're done. And of course, we have the Nature Conservancy as a great partner that we can work with as technically a private landowner. So we worked one unit called Spunky Bottoms across from Meridosia, where we're doing some work now. And just to zoom in on that picture, you have, duck food growing right next to Boltonia there in the background. So that's what gets our duck clubs excited about the management for the species. And nothing that we do is ever for one species. Our target is Boltonia decurrens, but we've also have a responsibility. We want duck food as well, and we want pollinator value as well. So we're getting all that. We're getting bidens, the beggar ticks, to take off as well, and that is a great pollen or nectar source. And so are some of the other moist soil plants. But in addition to their pollinator value, they have incredible duck energy value as well. So the challenges that we're facing so far, now that we're about 1 or 2 years into this, about 2 years into it, is the river. We knew the river, the changes in the river over the last century has impacted Boltonia based on the levee system and the loss of maybe the scouring flood events. We have a lot of the ponding, but we might not have the scouring flood events. But even with that, we're working in these areas and we have a small window to get the equipment in there. to grind and disc before the river comes back up. We are using some amphibious excavators to get in there, and that's been helpful. Even though trees can be small diameter, there's a lot of mulch that it puts on the ground. So you really have to take time mulching and disking, and that costs more money. And there's other methods, a dozer, pushing it into a pile and burning it. But you have other permitting issues. One, you can't remove stumps and wetlands. For the most part, you can through a nationwide 27 if you have good justification. And then in a floodway, you cannot down a tree in a floodway. You have to mulch it up or burn it. So we have to kind of start off with the mulching and then disc to make sure it's incorporated and not a flood hazard later on. And then contractors, we're trying to dial in what contractors have the right equipment and can get in there and tackle it when the timing is right. And so we know that one of the things that we're going to change is we're going to specify the equipment that we want contractors to use as opposed to leaving it up to them, because the thought going into is they know their equipment better than I do. They're the ones operating it, so they know the ins and outs. And thought if we just told them we want bare ground there at the end, that they would tackle it and not have any issues. But I do know that we want to go big right off the bat, get in there with the biggest equipment you can find, because that river is going to jump up pretty quick before you want it to. So you want to get as much on the ground and disc up as you can. So that's one of the things we know will change here in the near future. And is it working? We don't know yet, but this summer and fall, we'll be able to test it out. We'll do our monitoring visits, go out to these duck clubs, go out to Spunky Bottoms and do some monitoring. Where did it come back? What else came back with it? And adapt to what we found, take what we're seeing in the field this first summer and know what worked and what didn't, and go from there. And hopefully we can fine tune this, and we'll have more duck food, fewer invasives, and more Boltonia in the very near future. And I believe that is all I have.